Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Pump. Senior Systems Officer Karesh Vennor first became concerned about the human engineer when he heard an argument in auxiliary engineering. Only one side was audible. "No," Jonah Beck said from behind the coolant manifold. "Absolutely not. You had your bearing replaced 2 months ago. You're not getting another one just because you woke up noisy." Karesh stopped outside the compartment. He checked the local maintenance net out of reflex. No active comm channel. No remote technician in Jonah's headset. No second life sign in the room. Jonah continued after a short pause. "Don't give me that noise. I know what you sound like when the bearing's bad. This isn't the bearing. You're being dramatic." Karesh entered. The human stood with one arm inside the inspection access of auxiliary coolant pump 4B, head tilted toward the machinery. He wore Dalari engineering coveralls altered badly to fit a human frame, sleeves rolled above the elbows, a vibration probe clipped to one wrist. There was a fresh burn mark across the back of one glove and a pencil tucked behind his ear, even though every maintenance station aboard the Kestrel Meridian had a digital interface. Jonah tapped the pump housing with 2 fingers. "That's better." Karesh waited until the human noticed him. "Oh, morning, boss. Who were you speaking to?" Jonah looked around as though the answer might be standing behind him. "The pump." Karesh waited again. Jonah went back to the access panel. "You were speaking to a coolant circulation pump," Karesh said. "Yeah, you understand it cannot hear you." Jonah glanced at the pump. "That's probably for the best." The human had been aboard 6 weeks as part of an engineering exchange negotiated between the Dalari Survey Authority and the Terran Cooperative Fleet. His personnel file described him as a propulsion and thermal systems engineer with 12 years of field experience on survey vessels, construction tenders, and 2 notoriously old human ore haulers. It also noted that he had grown up on Lagrange Habitat Series 12, where his parents maintained municipal water and atmosphere systems. Karesh had initially considered that last detail irrelevant. After 6 weeks with Jonah, he was beginning to suspect human personnel files hid the important information in the least impressive sentences. Jonah was not a prodigy. He had not published famous research. He possessed no military record and only one commendation, for keeping a crippled geological survey craft alive long enough to reach dock after a micrometeoroid strike. When Karesh had asked about that incident, Jonah had called it 3 ugly days and a lot of sealant, and changed the subject. What mattered was that the human was competent. He learned Dalari control architecture quickly, respected lockout procedures, asked questions before touching unfamiliar systems, and wrote maintenance reports with irritatingly precise measurements. He also argued with pumps. Karesh stepped closer to 4B. The status plate showed green, bearing temperature normal, flow nominal, current draw nominal, vibration below caution threshold. What exactly is wrong with it? "Nothing yet," Jonah said. "You just accused it of being dramatic, because it is." "Machines are not dramatic." Jonah held up a hand. "Bad technical language, I know. She's got a little extra vibration on spool-up, not much. Could be the upstream filter starting to load." "The pump has not alarmed." "I know, pull the 4-day current trend." Karesh did. The draw had climbed by less than 1%, still comfortably inside specification. Jonah pointed. "There. That is not enough to indicate bearing failure." "I didn't say bearing failure. I told her she wasn't getting another bearing." Karesh checked differential pressure across the upstream filter. Slight rise, again below maintenance threshold. Jonah smiled. Karesh opened the panel himself. The filter medium was beginning to clog with fine particulate from a coolant branch serviced the previous week. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous. 11 days remained before scheduled inspection. Jonah replaced it in 4 minutes. Pump current returned to its long-term baseline. The extra vibration disappeared on the next spool cycle. The human patted the housing. "See, you just wanted attention." Karesh stared at him. "Do not encourage the machinery." "I fixed it." "That is unrelated." "Probably." Karesh left before the conversation became less technical. He made it 14 meters down the corridor before Jonah's voice followed him. "Don't listen to him, sweetheart. You're doing great." Karesh kept walking. He decided the engineering exchange program required review. Chapter 2. Gary. The pump was not an isolated incident. Jonah spoke to power converters. He insulted valves. He thanked diagnostic tools when they produced useful readings and apologized to access panels after striking them with his shoulder. Worst of all, he gave machinery names. Karesh discovered this when Jonah entered main engineering carrying a replacement seal and called across the deck. "Anybody seen Gary?" Karesh looked up from a reactor load review. No one named Gary served aboard the Kestrel Meridian. The crew was overwhelmingly Dalari, with 3 Resilian scientists, 2 Pelari navigators, and 1 human exchange engineer. "Who is Gary?" Karesh asked. Jonah pointed toward the aft maintenance bay. "Little crawler. Unit M17, if that's Gary's government name." Karesh's facial folds tightened. "Robots do not have government names," a junior Dalari technician called from beneath a power regulator. "He's in environmental." Karesh turned toward her. "You know what he means." She looked surprised by the question. "Yes, Gary." That was not an answer. Before Karesh could pursue it, the maintenance crawler rolled through the hatch. Its tool rack carried 3 plasma cutters, a diagnostic coil, 2 cable clamps, and the wrong torque driver. Jonah intercepted it. "Buddy, where's the insulated driver?" Gary rotated its sensor cluster. A compartment opened, revealing fasteners from an old work order. Jonah sighed. "I swear to God." Karesh stepped closer. "Is the unit malfunctioning?" "No." Somebody loaded the old task list without clearing the buffer. Jonah reset the local queue. The crawler chirped. Yeah, not your fault. You are absolving a machine of responsibility it cannot possess." "I'm aware." "Then why do it?" Jonah considered. "Habit." That answer bothered Karesh enough that he asked about it later, during the quiet middle of a survey watch when no alarms demanded attention. They were alone beside the secondary thermal board. Jonah was calibrating a handheld sensor against a fixed reference. Karesh said, "Your file states that you learned engineering on Series 12. Jonah looked up. "My file says that. It says your parents were municipal systems technicians. My mother still is. Dad retired and now bothers everybody at the Habitat Repair Cooperative for free." "Did they also name machinery?" Jonah laughed. "Oh, absolutely. My mother had a wastewater pump called St. Agnes because it only answered prayers after midnight." Karesh waited for the joke to end. Jonah saw his expression and added, "We lived in a habitat built in stages over 80 years. Half the water system was older than I was. Sensors told you when something crossed a limit, but the people who kept the place alive knew what each pump sounded like in winter, which valve stuck after pressure cycling, which compressor ran hot after a dust shutdown. Those observations should be documented." "They were. Eventually." Jonah adjusted the sensor. "But when you're 10 years old following your mother through a service tunnel, she doesn't say, compressor 7's outlet temperature is 3.2% above seasonal baseline. She says, hear that, Old Red is breathing heavy again. You remember Old Red." Karesh studied him. Jonah continued. "Later you learn the numbers matter, but the story sticks to them." That was the first explanation Karesh had received that did not sound entirely absurd. It did not solve the naming problem. Within another week, several Dalari technicians had adopted Jonah's labels. 2 redundant coolant pumps became the Twins. A delicate sensor package was Princess. An old power converter whose reliability bordered on offensive was Brick. Karesh resisted all of them. Engineering required precision. Emotional descriptions introduced ambiguity. Then a junior technician said, "Princess is drifting again," and Karesh immediately knew she meant sensor package 60. He disliked that intensely. Chapter 3. Normal. Karesh confronted Jonah during the weekly systems review. The human was eating something from a foil packet while reading maintenance notes. Karesh placed a tablet in front of him. "This entry." Jonah read his own note. "Thermal regulator 7C slightly unhappy during cold restart. Recheck actuator timing next cycle." "Yeah. Slightly unhappy is not an engineering measurement." "Nope." Karesh scrolled down. The formal data followed. Actuator response 84 milliseconds above long-term baseline. Current increase measurable but below caution threshold. Inspection recommended after the next thermal cycle. Complete, precise, useful. "You documented the values correctly," Karesh said. "Why include the imprecise description?" "So I remember what kind of problem I'm looking for." "The values tell you that." "The values tell me what's measurable." "The phrase reminds me what 7C is usually like." Karesh folded both upper arms. "Normal is defined by operational limits." Jonah shook his head. "Acceptable is defined by operational limits. Normal is what that particular piece of hardware does when it's healthy." That answer stayed with Karesh because he could not immediately dismiss it. Dalari maintenance doctrine emphasized class behavior. A regulator of a given model was expected to operate within an approved envelope. Predictive systems tracked drift toward failure thresholds. The Kestrel Meridian had excellent diagnostics. But Karesh also knew that 2 supposedly identical pumps rarely sounded identical after years of service. One actuator always responded a little faster. One converter carried load with almost no trimming. Experienced technicians knew those differences even when doctrine did not give them elegant names. Jonah had simply turned those differences into personalities. You compare the component against itself, Karesh said. Exactly. And the informal description acts as a memory aid. Exactly. That does not justify calling power converter 9C brick, Jonah smiled. Brick doesn't care. Brick is incapable of caring. See, you're getting it. Karesh should have ended the conversation there. Instead, he asked, "Why did you become an engineer?" The question surprised Jonah enough that he stopped eating. You are competent in several fields, Karesh continued. You could have specialized in design, research, or ship architecture. You chose maintenance-heavy survey work. Jonah looked toward main engineering. The Kestrel Meridian systems hummed steadily around them. I like things that already exist, he said after a moment. Designers get to imagine what a machine should be. Maintenance people meet what it became. Karesh waited. Jonah shrugged. Every ship picks up history, repairs, replacements, parts from different production runs, crew workarounds, little scars nobody planned. You learn the real ship, not the clean one from the manual. That sounds inefficient. It is. It's also real. Jonah looked down at 7C's trend line. First survey ship was older than me. We had a cryogenic pump that passed every diagnostic for 6 months before it failed. Old Chief kept saying it sounded lonely on startup. Nobody took him seriously because the numbers were green. Turned out one mount had cracked and the housing was flexing under a specific thermal condition. The sensor was mounted on the part that moved with it, so it never saw the relative vibration. Karesh's expression changed. Did the failure cause casualties? No. It cost us 9 days and a very expensive tow. I was 19, and I spent most of those 9 days listening to the chief say, "Told you she was lonely." Jonah smiled without humor. I learned 2 things. First, old engineers are unbearable when they're right. Second, green means the machine hasn't convinced the computer it's sick yet. Karesh looked at 7C again. Karesh did not know how soon he would need to understand the distinction. Chapter 4. The Walkdown. Karesh learned that Jonah's strangest habit was not talking to machines. It was walking. The Kestrel Meridian possessed continuous monitoring across every important engineering space. Temperatures, pressures, vibration, current, flow, timing, atmospheric composition, and hundreds of other values appeared instantly at Karesh's station. Under ordinary conditions, there was no technical reason for a senior engineer to spend 2 hours physically walking the ship. Jonah did it anyway. Every 4th shift, he took a handheld sensor, a flashlight, and the battered paper notebook and made a circuit from reactor control to auxiliary coolant through power conversion past the environmental plant and down the propulsion access spine. On his 7th week aboard, Karesh joined him. Inspection? Jonah asked. Observation. Of me? Yes, that's less creepy when you say it in your voice. They started beside the secondary pumps. Jonah did not simply look at displays. He put a hand against housings, checked fasteners that had already passed torque verification, looked beneath cable trays, and stood still in several compartments for long enough that Karesh became impatient. What are you waiting for? Nothing. Then why are we stationary? Jonah pointed around the compartment. Because this is what it sounds like when nothing's wrong. Karesh listened. Fans, coolant, relay clicks, a distant pump cycle through the deck. None of it seemed informative. Jonah moved on. At environmental, he greeted Gary, who was carrying the correct tools for once. At the aft converter bank, he rested 2 fingers against Brick's casing. In propulsion support, he stopped beside a conduit and frowned. Hear that? Karesh listened again. Cooling flow. Under it. There was a faint metallic tick every several seconds. Karesh checked the nearest sensor. No vibration alarm, no structural warning. Jonah crouched and followed the sound along the conduit until he found a cable support clamp touching a thin access cover. Thermal expansion had shifted the conduit barely enough that the 2 surfaces contacted during a cooling cycle. Nothing dangerous. Jonah inserted a small isolation pad and retorqued the clamp. The ticking stopped. That warranted 2 hours of walking, Karesh asked. That one thing? No, the walk is how I noticed the one thing. They continued. Near the propulsion access spine, Jonah told him about the ore hauler Mabel Rook, the oldest ship on his work history. She had spent 41 years carrying refined metals between asteroid processing sites before a survey contractor bought her because the hull was cheap and the engines were probably good for another decade. Were they? Karesh asked. 7 years, which is close enough if you're the person selling the ship. Jonah had been 24 when he joined her crew. The vessel vibrated under acceleration, leaked heat through 3 generations of insulation, and had so many replacement parts that one coolant branch contained hardware from 4 manufacturers and 2 different standards. The manual couldn't tell you what she was supposed to sound like, Jonah said. There wasn't one supposed to anymore. The crew knew. The chief engineer made every new hire walk the ship before and after each major burn. No tablet for the first pass. No staring at trends. Listen, smell, feel, look. Then check the numbers. Why numbers second? Karesh asked. Because if you see green first, green gets in your head, you start trying to prove the computer right. Karesh disliked the accusation because it described a real cognitive failure mode. Jonah continued. Other way around is bad too. You can convince yourself every noise is a disaster. That's why you go back to the data, feel something weird, then prove or disprove it. So the intuition is not the diagnosis. God, no. Intuition tells you where to look. That distinction mattered. At the end of the walk, they returned to main engineering. Karesh reviewed the route log and found no significant faults. The conduit clamp Jonah had corrected barely qualified as maintenance. He expected the human to consider the walk unproductive. Jonah wrote 3 notes instead. One fan had changed pitch slightly after a recent filter replacement and should be checked again next shift. A valve actuator sounded normal, but was accumulating more cycle time than its twin. The aft deck vibration during low reactor load had changed after cargo redistribution and should not be mistaken for machinery drift. Karesh read the notes. None of these require action. Correct. Then why record them? Jonah closed the notebook. So next month, if something changes again, we know where it started. Karesh thought about maintenance as a chain of isolated repairs. Jonah appeared to think of it as biography. The idea was technically offensive. It was also useful. 2 days later, the Kestrel Meridian lost main propulsion. Chapter 5. The Transient. The ship was 6 days from the nearest support station, conducting a deep space gravimetric survey around a young stellar remnant when the power transient struck. The maneuver was routine. Reactor output increased. Propulsion capacitors charged. Main drive entered the first stage of a controlled burn. Then every light on the bridge went white. For less than a second, the entire power network surged. Protection systems reacted faster than any crew member could. Main drive disconnected. Reactor isolation engaged. Non-essential loads dropped. Auxiliary power took over. The Kestrel Meridian fell quiet. Karesh was in engineering before the alarm finished repeating. His people arrived almost with him. No panic, no confusion. They had trained for power transients and the ship had done what it was designed to do. Containment remained intact. Life support was stable. No fire, no pressure loss. Drive capacitors isolated before serious damage. Good. The ship had protected itself. How they had to discover what it had protected itself from. Karesh took the primary systems station and began assigning checks. Reactor stable in shutdown. Main bus isolated and under inspection. Propulsion core showed no direct damage. Environmental systems remained on auxiliary. Jonah arrived wearing one boot incorrectly fastened and a maintenance shirt under half-zipped coveralls. Karesh looked at the boot. Didn't have time, Jonah said. You had time to put it on. Debatable what happened. Karesh summarized the transient. Jonah took a diagnostic station. Anything actually blow? Several protective elements tripped. No major component failure detected. That's annoying. This is not the time for emotional classification. This is exactly the time. The first restart attempt failed. Reactor power reached minimum operational output normally. Primary bus came online. Environmental systems transferred. Then propulsion control reported timing disagreement across 3 nodes. Karesh halted the sequence. The second attempt failed differently. Timing was nominal, but a coolant regulator oscillated during load transition. Automation compensated. A power converter reported a momentary reference mismatch, corrected it, and returned to green. No threshold violation persisted long enough to identify a source. Full diagnostic sweep passed. Karesh ran it again. Everything passed again. Main propulsion still refused to complete initialization because multiple systems could not agree closely enough during synchronized power handoff. Software? Karesh asked. Clean. Control network. Packet integrity nominal. Clock distribution within tolerance. Sensor cross-check within tolerance. Jonah leaned toward the engineering display. Karesh recognized the expression from the pump. What? Coolant 2 is pushing harder than she should. The nearest technician checked. Flow demand had increased 2%. Still nominal, Karesh said. Yeah, power regulator 4 is trimming down too. Thermal loops chasing load. That is its purpose. Jonah did not answer. He simply stared at the board as if it were a face he knew well. Karesh understood that the human was listening to machinery that was not speaking. For the first time, he did not find the idea entirely ridiculous. Chapter 6. Everything is fine. 6 hours later, the situation had become worse without becoming dangerous. Karesh found that more stressful than a clear failure. Clear failures had causes, causes had repairs. The Kestrel Meridian appeared to be suffering from widespread indecision. Every major subsystem was operational by itself. Coolant circulation remained safe. Reactor controls were stable at low power. Primary electrical distribution functioned. Navigation worked. Environmental systems were comfortable. The drive core showed no physical damage, yet every attempt to transition into higher coordinated load produced small disagreements. A pump accelerated slightly before expected. A regulator corrected voltage downward and then returned to nominal. Sensor 60 reported a transient discrepancy. An actuator hesitated. A thermal controller compensated. Each error vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. The automation handled them. That was the problem. Every system was correcting for something. No system admitted what. Karesh's engineers swapped control modules, isolated coolant branches, inspected network trunks, compared independent reactor and propulsion references, and replaced a regulator that had shown repeated drift. The replacement behaved exactly like the original. The crew remained disciplined, but fatigue began to show around the edges. Meal trays appeared beside consoles and went cold. Junior technicians started asking the same questions twice. Karesh ordered mandatory 20-minute rest rotations and received the usual looks from people who believed rules about fatigue applied to everyone except them. Jonah disappeared into the lower engineering bays for almost an hour. When he returned, his coveralls were dirty and he carried a vibration sensor, 3 trend overlays, and a paper notebook. Karesh stared at the notebook. Why is that not digital? Because I can draw arrows on paper without the interface deciding. I meant something intelligent. Anything useful? Forby is annoyed. Karesh closed his eyes briefly. Translate. Pump current rises during transition. Princess gets jittery when thermal load comes up. Brick is trimming output. 7C delays. All remain within specification. I know. Karesh looked at the old converter called Brick. Power converter 9C was a simple unit, old enough that it had been scheduled for replacement twice and removed from the schedule twice because it refused to justify the expense. Its output stability was famously boring. Now it was trimming by less than 1%. Jonah whispered at the board, "What the hell are you all doing?" Karesh asked. "Are you speaking to us?" "No, everybody's lying." "Machines do not lie." Jonah waved a hand. "Not lying, they're compensating." Karesh almost corrected him, then remembered the old cryogenic pump on Jonah's first survey ship. Jonah spread the trend overlays across the console. "Look at direction, not symptom. Pump pushes harder. Regulator trims down. Sensor package shifts late. Actuator delays. Thermal controller adds correction. Different systems, same load transition." Karesh overlaid the timestamps. The events aligned more closely than he had realized, not perfectly, close enough. "Common load event," he said. "Something tells the ship one thing, reality does something slightly different, and everybody downstream cleans it up. We tested primary synchronization." "I know. It passes." Jonah rubbed both hands over his face. "Then maybe the thing telling everybody it's fine is the thing that's wrong." That was not evidence. It was, however, a testable accusation. Karesh ordered the primary timing and reference network opened for full review. Chapter 7. Talking through it. The reference network consisted of 3 redundant master units distributing synchronized timing and calibration signals across major control systems. All 3 reported healthy. Signal integrity checks passed. Phase agreement remained within Dalari specification. Isolating each master independently produced no permanent fault. After the 3rd clean result, Karesh began considering whether the human's theory had been attractive only because every conventional test had failed. Jonah did not abandon it. Instead, he walked the physical route. Karesh followed because the ship's senior systems officer could not permit an exchange engineer to dismantle half of engineering unsupervised. Also because he was curious, though he did not state that reason. Jonah started at reactor control and moved through coolant distribution, propulsion synchronization, power regulation, and the sensor network. At each stop, he talked aloud. "Okay, sweetheart, you're hot because 2 is pushing too hard. 2's pushing because return pressure is a little weird. Return pressure's weird because flow timing is late." Karesh listened differently this time. The human was not pretending the machine answered. He was externalizing a chain of cause and effect. At sensor 60, Jonah said, "Princess gets fussy because her calibration margins narrow. She notices tiny timing garbage before the big stuff does." At power converter 9C, he said, "Brick doesn't move. If Brick moves, something upstream deserves attention." At 7C, he said, And you sulk after cold soak even when everything's fine, so I'm discounting half of what you're telling me. Karesh stopped him. Your nicknames are categories. Jonah turned. What? Princess means a component with narrow calibration tolerance. Brick means a component with unusually stable baseline behavior. Sulking describes a known conditional delay. Jonah stared at him. That is the most alien way anybody has ever described me talking shit to machinery. You have encoded maintenance history into informal identities. Pretty much. That is not the same as random personification. Never said it was random. Karesh thought of the Dalari maintenance database. It knew component classes, approved envelopes, failure thresholds, service dates, and historical trend lines. It did not know that brick almost never moved unless the cause was upstream, because that fact existed across thousands of separate records without being elevated into a single useful statement. Jonah knew it immediately. The automation compares the hardware against tolerances, Karesh said, and I compare it against itself. Experienced Dalari engineers do that, sure. They do not call the converter brick. Their loss. They reached the primary reference junction. 3 master timing units glowed green. Jonah looked at them for almost a minute, then he pointed to the center module. That one. Master reference 2 passes diagnostics. I know. Why that one? Jonah rested his fingers against the housing. He did not claim to feel anything mystical. He checked the mount, the cooling line, and the cable strain. Then he looked back at the trend overlays. Because everything downstream gets weird only when load and temperature rise together. 2 kept master priority after the transient. If she's just a little wrong under one condition, everybody else would look guilty. That remains insufficient evidence. Absolutely. Karesh waited. Jonah smiled. So let's make her uncomfortable. That at least sounded like engineering. Chapter 8. The wrong clock. They moved master reference 2 to a controlled test configuration and began stressing it across conditions the normal diagnostic routine evaluated separately. At nominal temperature it passed. At elevated temperature it passed. Under simulated load transition it passed. Jonah crossed his arms. Do both. Karesh raised the environmental chamber toward the upper end of normal operating temperature and applied repeated synchronization demands. For several cycles, nothing happened. Then phase noise increased by a tiny amount. Still within tolerance, Karesh leaned closer. Repeat. They cooled the module. Noise vanished. Heated it again. Noise returned. A simulated transition followed. For less than half a second, master reference 2 developed a phase offset. Tiny, below independent alarm threshold. Its internal correction eliminated the error almost immediately. Jonah whispered, "Got you." Karesh repeated the test 5 times. The pattern held. A microfracture in the oscillator's thermal compensation assembly, probably worsened by the original power transient, allowed slight drift only when heat and transition load arrived together. The error was not large enough to make the master classify itself as faulty. It was large enough to make every dependent subsystem compensate in a different way. Why did redundancy not reject it? Jonah asked. Karesh checked the architecture. Master 2 retained priority after the transient. Masters 1 and 3 synchronized to it because health monitoring remained green. So everybody followed the slightly wrong clock. Yes, the diagnosis propagated through the ship in a satisfying wave. Coolant controllers had responded early to one relationship. Power regulators trimmed against another. Sensor 60's narrow margins made it appear unstable. Actuators corrected command timing. Thermal management chased the aggregate effect. Nothing failed dramatically. Everything worked harder. Karesh looked at Jonah. You were correct. The human's entire exhausted face brightened. I need that recorded. It will be in the incident report. Verbally too. I just said it. Again, no. An alarm interrupted them. Reactor control stability had begun to degrade after repeated partial load cycles. The margin was still safe, but Karesh was finished asking the ship for favors. Controlled shutdown, he ordered. Troubleshooting ends until reference distribution is repaired. Jonah checked the trend. Give me 1 diagnostic cycle first. Isolate 2, force 1 independent, and see if the wobble disappears. Master 1 is not synchronized for full ship load. Doesn't need full load, just enough to prove the chain. Karesh considered the margins, then nodded. 30 seconds, Jonah smiled. Luxury. They switched Master 2 out. Master 1 took independent reference. A low-power transition began, coolant stabilized, power regulation flattened. Sensor 60 stopped drifting. For a moment, the reactor control bus hesitated. Jonah placed one hand against the console. Come on, sweetheart, don't do this to me now. Karesh could not help himself. It still cannot hear you. Jonah did not look up. I'm not talking to her for her benefit. The reactor controller settled. Compensation noise vanished across the board. Every downstream system agreed for the first time in hours. There was the proof. "Shut down," Karesh ordered. The ship returned safely to auxiliary power. They had found the fault. Now they needed a replacement. The spare master reference unit had been damaged during the original transient. Chapter 9. No spare. The spare's outer housing looked intact. Its oscillator assembly did not survive startup testing. Jonah stared at the failed unit. "That's rude." Karesh, after 16 hours awake, did not object to the terminology. They had no replacement oscillator and no compatible thermal compensation package. Support remained 6 days away at auxiliary crews, longer if they could not restore main propulsion. Jonah looked at the inventory. "So what do we build it from?" That question changed the room. Until then, Karesh had been leading diagnosis. Improvisation brought his own specialty back to the center. The Kestrel Meridian was a research vessel. Navigation maintained an independent precision reference for gravimetric measurement, far more stable than engineering required. "The gravimetric clock," Karesh said. Jonah's eyes sharpened. "Can it drive engineering?" "Not directly, different signal architecture." "But," Karesh projected the interface, "its output can be converted." Jonah leaned over the diagram. "We build a bridge, a temporary translation layer. Engineer for bridge." "No," they worked. This time the repair did not belong to Jonah. That mattered. Karesh designed the phase translation and isolation architecture because Dalari reference systems were his field. 2 technicians built redundant converters. Jonah modified a secondary control bus so the new reference could be introduced without forcing every downstream system to reboot simultaneously. Navigation surrendered one precision output channel with the kind of reluctance engineers displayed when another department touched their equipment. At one point, the chief navigator arrived in person. "If you damage the gravimetric clock," she told Karesh, "I will report you. If we do not use it, we will reach the next station 3 days late. I will report you after we arrive." Jonah nodded respectfully. "That's fair." The navigator stared at him. "Why is the temporary converter labeled Gary 2? Karesh turned slowly. Jonah was already removing the label. 3 hours later, they had an improvised master reference source that no shipyard would approve for permanent service. Karesh inspected every connection. Signal quality excellent. Isolation verified. 1 backup path through Master 3. Manual failure handling until the system proved itself. Jonah looked at the hardware. "Ugly but loyal. It is temporary." "That's what I said." They initiated restart. Auxiliary systems first. Then environmental. Then reactor, power climbed, the temporary reference held, 4B remained steady. Brick stopped trimming. Princess stayed inside her individual baseline through thermal transition. 7C hesitated exactly as much as 7C always hesitated, and no more. Jonah watched the board as though greeting old coworkers after a bad night. Main propulsion initialization began. The drive core synchronized. No timing disagreement. No compensatory cascade. Power handoff completed. For one long second, engineering heard nothing unusual. Then the familiar low vibration of the main drive returned through the deck. Several Dalari technicians made sounds dangerously close to cheering. Jonah leaned both hands against the console and closed his eyes. Karesh saw the human's shoulders sag. Beneath the jokes and the talking and the ridiculous names, Jonah had been afraid too, not of being wrong, of failing to get the ship home. Karesh understood that fear. Every engineer did. Jonah looked toward the reactor display. "There you go. That's better, sweetheart." Karesh did not correct him. He was too tired. That was the reason, he was almost certain. Chapter 10. What normal feels like. The Kestrel Meridian resumed course at reduced power. Karesh kept the temporary reference system under continuous observation until he trusted it, which took 12 hours. Jonah slept for 6 of them. When he returned, his hair was flattened on one side and he carried the beverage humans insisted was coffee. Karesh was finishing the incident log. Jonah sat beside him. "Did we explode?" "No." "Good shift." Karesh looked over. "I have a question." "That's ominous." "Did speaking to the machinery assist the repair?" Jonah laughed, then realized Karesh was serious. "Not the way you're asking. I am asking whether vocalizing observations contributes to diagnosis." Jonah rotated the cup between both hands. "Sometimes, talking makes me slow down. If I say 4B sounds wrong, I have to decide what wrong means. If I say Brick's trimming, I remember Brick basically never trims. If I call Princess fussy, I know which kind of fussy I'm talking about." "You have attached behavioral summaries to informal identities." Jonah pointed at him. "Don't ruin it," Karesh continued. "The summaries compress experience." "Yeah, but that's not all of it." Jonah looked through the glass toward main engineering. The deck was boring again, pumps humming, converters holding load, displays staying green without secretly fighting each other. On old ships, you spend years with the same hardware. You know the sound when a fan bearings dry. You know one valve needs a little more time after cold soak. You know the deck vibration when a pump has air in it. Talking to it is partly a joke, but it's also how a lot of us keep that familiarity active. Humans are not the only species with experienced maintainers. Of course not. That answer pleased Karesh. Jonah continued. The human part might just be that we're shameless about acting like the machine is a coworker. An inaccurate coworker. Most coworkers are inaccurate. Karesh ignored that. He finished the formal report. Cross-system compensatory behavior had indicated common reference instability despite nominal individual diagnostic states. Local operator familiarity had enabled recognition of anomalous trends before automated threshold detection. Jonah read over his shoulder. That's an extremely fancy way of saying everybody was acting funny. It is an accurate way. Fancy and accurate can coexist. Karesh added a recommendation. Future predictive tools should compare individual components against their own historical behavior, not only against class tolerance ranges. That at least was precise. Useful, professional. No personalities required. Across engineering, Jonah yelled, "Gary, buddy, that's the wrong sealant." Karesh closed his eyes. Some problems had no engineering solution. Chapter 11. Trevor. The Kestrel Meridian reached a repair station 5 days later. Shipyard engineers replaced Master Reference 2 and the damaged spare, inspected Karesh's improvised synchronization bridge and described it as creative. Karesh accepted that word. Jonah described it as ugly but loyal. Karesh refused to accept that one. The exchange program continued. So did the changes Jonah had accidentally introduced. Technicians began recording longer individual component histories. Not merely alarm thresholds and scheduled service, but characteristic start vibration, known cold response lag, unusual stability, recurring behaviors after maintenance, and observations from the people who worked around the hardware every day. The terminology remained formal, mostly. A junior technician told Karesh, "Princess is stable after recalibration." Karesh answered, "Sensor 60 is stable." She nodded. "That's what I said." It was not. Karesh stopped correcting her every time. He told himself this was because communication efficiency mattered more than style. A month passed without another serious failure. Then during a late watch, flow regulator 3A hesitated. Karesh was alone in auxiliary engineering. The regulator controlled secondary coolant distribution for a laboratory branch. No danger, no alarm. The actuator cycled, paused for a fraction too long, then completed normally. Karesh checked diagnostics. Green. He opened the response history. Slightly slower than its own baseline. The regulator cycled again, another hesitation. Karesh narrowed his eyes. "Do not start." Silence followed. He froze. There was no one else in the compartment. He had spoken to machinery. That was unacceptable. Karesh immediately opened the actuator history to establish that the remark had been a rational response to measurable evidence. Current draw had risen slightly under cold conditions. Lubrication degradation was possible. Real, technical, measurable. Good. He created a maintenance ticket. Behind him, Jonah said, "Who are you talking to?" Karesh nearly struck the console. The human stood in the hatch holding a diagnostic kit and wearing an expression of enormous satisfaction. "No one," Karesh said. Jonah looked toward 3A, then back at him. "Sure, I was expressing irritation. To the regulator." "No, you literally looked at it." Karesh refused to dignify that with a response. Jonah came closer. "What'd it do?" "Minimal, repeatable actuator delay with a slight current increase under cold conditions." Jonah opened the trend and nodded. "Good catch, getting grumpy. Lubrication response may be degrading. That's a yes." "It is not." Jonah collected his diagnostic kit and started toward the access panel. Before opening it, he looked back. "You know, if you want, we can name him." "No, definitely sounds like a Trevor. Leave. I'm literally here to fix it." "Then stop speaking." Jonah laughed and opened the panel. Karesh returned to the console while the human inspected the actuator. 3A cycled once more and hesitated only slightly. Karesh leaned closer to the display. Very quietly, so the human would not hear, he said, "I meant it." From inside the access panel, Jonah answered, "Trevor heard you." Karesh closed his eyes. The exchange program required review.